2 centuries. We talked about blood quantum, we talked about relocation, we talked about non-Indian dominance in tribal government. Everything that was said thus far, I will relate to you at least through the legal prism, as we've titled our presentation, by way of federal laws that have been passed in Washington, D.C. on behalf of Indians without Indian input that have caused the predicament we're now in. We're in an identity crisis or an indigeneity crisis. We're in a disenrollment crisis. We're in a citizenship crisis as a result of a lot of things that have happened that were beyond our control. So I'm going to come back to the computer here. And the last part of my presentation will be the art part that Robert and I titled it. And I'll tell you about a grassroots video advocacy movement that is just starting, and a few folks in the room have already participated, a few folks in the room have asked to participate or volunteered to participate. And I'll just leave you with this image. And I'm going to talk a lot about disenrollment today because I think that's the biggest threat to our existence right now. The idea that we will terminate our own people for sake of casino profits, for sake of political longevity, for sake of power or vendetta. But this movement is designed to basically visually demonstrate stop. We're going to stop it. And in one word, Native Americans, on behalf of those who are perhaps no longer Native American, at least legally, are writing on their palms what that word disenrollment means. And so this is an example from Karen Lubenow, the chairwoman of the Snoqualmie tribe. And I just ask you to think about this word disenrollment and maybe think about your own word. And if at the end of this conversation you want to join this by putting this pen to your hand, we'll snap your picture and get you a part of this this movement that we're just about to embark on. This is some language from a paper that I quoted in a paper that I just wrote. And I wanted to take us back to where we were before treaties. Before there was notions of, today, citizenship or membership. It was simple. It was called kinship. And this language is, I think, powerful, which is why I've got it up here. Kinship not only included those with whom one could trace family, familial common descent, but could be extended to include more ramifying groups like clans, moieties, or even nations. And besides blood relationship or biological reproduction, individuals and groups could be recruited into a kinship network of tribal society through naturalization, which is like citizenship, adoption, marriage, or even alliance. Identity encompassed inner qualities that were made manifest through social action and cultural belief. It wasn't because you had a certificate from the Bureau of Indian Affairs or some degree of Indian blood, or even any degree of Indian blood. It was because you had a social connection and a cultural belief that was common. And it transcended race, it transcended class, it transcended geography, it transcended residence, and all the things that are now part of this conversation about what it means to be Indian. Now, at the time, there were certainly examples of classism within tribal communities or stratification, clans. Some were more powerful than others. Cherokee Indians owned slaves, they owned African American slaves, and those people ultimately became part of their society, and they are now, of course, disavowing their inclusion in who they are as Cherokee or their participation as citizens. So it wasn't perfect then, but the idea was kinship. The idea was not what we talk about now in terms of blood quantum, membership, or citizenship. But what followed was 2 centuries of federal laws passed in Washington, D.C. by the United States Congress that are genocidal. They are designed to extinguish us. And I want to go through those with you, dating back to treaties, talking about the Dawes era, talking about the reorganization era, termination era. Even self-determination is genocidal in some respects. And certainly Indian gaming, in effect, is having I think a disastrous effect in terms of terminating who we are as Indian people for sake of commercial ideology and greed. But this whole idea of blood, we talked about the zero bloods or the no bloods or the mixed bloods, or the full bloods, in fact. If you look to this definition, the way things were, it wasn't a question of blood. This was introduced by European colonizers before treaties were even around, because this is how Europeans identify. You hear things of blue blood as identity for people coming from Europe. Bloodline was how Europeans identified, but it's not how Native Americans or indigenous peoples to these lands identified. But when the colonizers showed up, they began to identify Indians by quote-unquote Indian blood. We were referred to as mixed or unmixed. And really the idea of mixed blood was one that they thought was favorable, because they thought it meant if you have Caucasian blood, you are more likely to assimilate into Caucasian society. So the idea of mixed blood in the eyes of the colonizers was actually a good thing. And ultimately this whole idea of blood or bloodline or mixed blood or half-blood fed into what we've now been subject to for the better part of 2 centuries, which is this idea of manifest destiny and Indian land dispossession. That brought us to the treaties in the 1800s and ultimately removal. And now you're talking about Indian identity for the purposes of identifying who is the chief of a tribe or a tribal community. Because the United States thought if you can identify the chief, you can identify the person who will have the power to basically cede land to the United States through treaty. Again, identification of the chief. Identification suggesting the notion of identity. Identifying who is Indian. And these bloodlines began to play a part of that conversation as well. During treaty times, after the chief was identified, people would begin to identify Indians by 1/4 Indian, 3/4 Indian, half-breed Indians. And again, there was this idea that if you are part Caucasian blood, that you had a heightened ability cognitively to assimilate. In fact, what they found out, though, is that it actually backfired, because the half-bloods had so-called heightened cognitive ability, and the United States found it more difficult to assimilate them because they would question why they were being removed. They would question why treaties were being signed. So this idea of blood, at least during treaty times or removal times, actually came back to kind of haunt the United States and the people that were trying to extinguish Indians. By the late 1800s, we're now talking about the allotment era. And as we all know, in 1887, the Dawes Act was passed. That was a law that ultimately caused 90 million acres of land that had been reserved through the treaties to pass into non-Indian ownership. And someone talked about the Dawes Rolls just a minute ago. This is where the idea of rolls were introduced. From what I can understand, there was no rolls or censuses of Indians, meaning lists of who's an Indian, until it came time to dishonor the treaties and break the land holdings into individual land parcels for sake of having it wash away from tribal ownership altogether and into non-Indian ownership. But these rolls were created to identify Indians, to basically give them land that the United States knew would eventually fall into non-Indian hands. Now, there were 2 laws passed in the early 1900s that I like to remind people about, because everyone knows about the Dawes Act or the General Allotment Act in Indian country because of the disastrous effect it's had, but people don't talk about these other laws. 1906 was the Burke Act. And this was a system where after allotments had been created, meaning in 1887, large swaths of tribal communally held lands were designated for ownership by individual Indians. Well, now those individual allotments were passing into fee interests, meaning into fee parcels, over Indians who had been deemed competent. Meaning if you were deemed competent and therefore equivalent to a non-Indian, assimilating into society, now your land's going to pass out of individual allotment trust status and into fee partial status. And another way that the United States began to measure competence for sake of dispossession of that land was by blood. Again, this idea of mixed blood. And if you're of mixed blood, partially Caucasian blood, you're of higher cognitive ability, you're therefore competent, and therefore we can take your land from you, at least out of trust and into fee. 1907, this is a law that no one talks about. But if you want to talk about per capita and casino, well, here's where it came from. from the best I can tell.
What year was that?
1907. This is the Lacey Act. So after the Dawes Act and the Lacey Act, now the United States was interested in, quote-unquote, apportioning and allotting communally held monies. So the Dawes Act did away with tribally held lands. Well, what about tribal cash assets? Well, if you are deemed, quote-unquote, capable of managing your own affairs, let's divide up the communally held cash assets, allocate them to individual Indians on a pro rata basis, and the same thing will happen. Once you divide up that communal asset, it becomes divisible, and ultimately it washes away. I believe this idea of pro rata distribution of communal wealth in 1906 is what has given rise to per capita ever since, and certainly since 1988 when the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was passed. And it's no coincidence that the very next year, in the early 1900s, after these laws were passed, at places like Osage, that have very lucrative head rights or oil rights, they started disenrolling their own people. Meaning if there are so many of us now with this amount of oil rights, and what's left is this, with this amount of oil rights, we will be richer for it. And the idea was then to get rid of their own relatives for sake of those lucrative head rights. So 90 million acres later, and I don't know how many dollars later after these laws were passed, comes the Indian Reorganization Act in the 1934. And now you really get into the business of blood, because Congress determined that to be an Indian under the IRA, you must have, quote, 1/2 or more Indian blood. That's what made you a member. And these rolls from the Dawes days, coupled with blood quantum, gave the United States the idea that we would now become membership clubs. No longer notions of kinship or belonging, but we're now members. They introduced the idea of membership. And the corollary to membership is disenrollment. And what makes you a member is some identification on a roll that they created for purposes of taking your land, or perhaps some amount of Indian blood that they have used to identify you as capable of being assimilated. And we've never been the same. Under guise of quote-unquote reorganization, and at the time that they stemmed the hemorrhage of land, they introduced membership, they introduced blood quantum, residential requirements, and ultimately disenrollment. Then, of course, came the termination era in the 1950s, and that one speaks for itself. The idea was that Congress was going to terminate tribes altogether. And what they did was terminate them, and again, divide up tribally community-held land and other assets, liquidate those assets by disseminating them to quote-unquote members at the time of termination. Fast forward to the 1970s, and it's now called self-determination. And President Nixon, of course, famously uttered these words in a speech to Congress, suggesting that termination of days prior was wrong. It was time for a decisive change, moving away from the past to create a new era where the Indian future is determined by Indian acts and Indian decisions. And this was called self-determination. And that's all good and well, but come 1975, when the seminal piece of legislation was passed by Congress implementing this vision, the Indian Self-Determination, Education, and Assistance Acts, tribes were basically given the power to do things, or given back the power to do things that the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the federal government had always done for them. And that actually includes deciding who's a member, enrolling members and other things. But there were some significant purse strings attached, because with that statute, the assistance part of the statute was funding. Well, if you didn't adopt an IRA constitution in 1934 or since, and therefore adopt notions of membership, or blood quantum, or even disenrollment, you wouldn't get the funding in 1975 unless you adopted a membership ordinance that, again, talked about membership, and blood quantum, and disenrollment. What's that?
I don't think Navajos were IRA back then.
We weren't.
Right.
And
So if you're
the Self-Determination Act was based on the Buy Indian Act, and the first Buy Indian Act school was Rough Rock Community Demonstration School, which was actually one of the first clients I got. But that like started in '68, and it, you know, I guess it did well. I mean, it was kind of cool because it was, you know, the idea was that rather than the bureau, the people in D.C., you know, essentially setting the curriculum standards and whatnot, they got to have the community members do that. Yeah, so Navajo was actually really where you started to have a number of school boards, well, now they're called community-controlled school boards, but back then they were ISDA school boards, and it was pretty interesting how it worked out. But yeah,
The problem I have with the Self-Determination Act, though, is if you were a treaty tribe, meaning you rejected the IRA, you rejected notions of Anglo-American constitutional government, you wanted to rest on your treaty or you wanted to rest on tradition, well, the United States says that's fine, but you're not going to quote-unquote self-govern or be self-determinative. We're not going to fund those activities unless you essentially sign up to an IRA program. And your treaty is all good and well, but unless you have a membership ordinance that prescribes blood quantum or other criteria we've imposed and ultimately allows for disenrollment, you don't get the money. So you know what happened? And I could be wrong, but I think every single tribe since the 1970s, if they didn't do it back to 1934, signed up for the membership program, because that's how they would become self-governing or self-determinative in the eyes of the federal government. The United States set the terms of self-determination. And that's why I pose the question here, was it ultimately some notion of self-determination that was promulgated under these statutes in the 1970s? Then comes 1988, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, and as we all know, we're now talking about a $30 billion industry. Professor, actually out of Boulder, Professor Charles Wilkinson has described the matter as a forced transition to a cash economy. Needless to say, Indian country never experienced this kind of, at least cash wealth, before Indian gaming, and it has caused all sorts of challenges, if not problems. But in the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, much like the Lacey Act, 82 years or 92 years before, this idea of per capita distribution of communally held gaming wealth was interjected into the statute. Now, there's some academics that actually believe this was done for a nefarious purpose to actually perpetuate the sorts of problems that we're talking about. But perhaps more simply, what Indian gaming has done, I believe, is it has created a commercial ideology rather than a tribal ideology. Capitalism has overcome tribalism. Dollars are more important in many respects than whatever else it means to be Indian. We now have classes of Indians: upper class, middle class, lower class Indians, on reservation, off reservation, per capita Indians, non-per capita Indians. And that classism is not something that was ever really with us, I believe, to this extent before Indian gaming. We are now more exclusive than inclusive for sake of per capita. We have tribes that are not enrolling their children, to your point, for sake of sustained or greater per capita wealth for those who are already members. We have tribes that are disenrolling their relatives en masse by the hundreds and thousands so that they can increase by a few $100s a month their per capita wealth. And I believe this greed-addled idea of jettisoning relatives or disenrolling relatives has in many respects overcome what it means to be tribal, what it means to be indigenous, what it means to be kin. And again, some believe that is by federal design. I now believe we are in what I will call the self-termination era. 15% of tribes are disenrolling their relatives, meaning 80 some odd tribes, and there are probably more. It may happen behind closed doors. It may not get the notoriety that some of the cases we've talked about get. But 15% of the 567 federally recognized tribal governments or communities are now getting rid of their relatives. This is happening in 17 states, meaning not just in Washington or not just in California, but all across the country. It's hard to put a number on it, but we're talking about high thousands, maybe more than 10,000 Indians have lost their tribal existence or their tribal identity for sake of what we're talking about. And all the while the United States sits on its hands or turns a blind eye or deaf ear to the matter despite having created it under all the laws that I've just talked about. And here they are. Again, the treaties are how notions of identification of Indians started. And that was by bloodline imported from Europe. That was for sake of Indian land dispossession. Then came the Dawes Act, massive reservation land dispossession, meaning the lands that were reserved under the treaties were now being dispossessed. Then came the Burke Act, and those allotments that were the results of the dispossession of communally held lands were now passing into non-Indian ownership or fee interests. 1906, the Lacey Act is the corollary. Monetary assets were divided, and they washed away on a pro rata basis. This is the introduction of per capita that is now the most formidable force in Indian country. Then comes reorganization, and with that, notions of membership, notions of quantum, notions of residence, notions of disenrollment. Then comes termination, and you're terminated based upon ultimately membership, or the benefactors of the termination and the division of those assets were those who were deemed members under the Reorganization Act. Talked about Indian self-determination. Again, if you hadn't subscribed to that by way of reorganization, you now did not get federal funding unless you subscribed to these ideas of membership, quantum, and disenrollment. And perhaps most profoundly, the act that has helped create a $30 billion cash infusion into any country, and I can't ignore all the prosperity it's brought and all the good it's brought, but the idea that those assets could be distributed on a per capita basis, much like the pro rata distributions of tribal monies 82 years prior, has caused a disaster in Indian country. And this now is what we're starting to witness. This is indigeneity today. Armed standoffs and violence over casino monies. Murder over what it means to be an Indian, or what it means to receive benefits from an Indian tribe, or what it means to have those benefits taken away from you. Here's a scene from the Nooksack Tribal Court a couple years ago, about the time I needed Brother Robert's help. Imagine a group of 300 relatives gathered on this side of these cones, on this side of the police tape, on this side of the armed cops. And you can see that tape doesn't run all the way across because those cones can be pulled back, and those cars that are driven up right to the tribal court are the cars of the tribe's lawyers, cars of the tribal council, and the cars of others. But if you're one of 306 relatives who are drumming and praying and holding hands in hope that you're not executed, essentially, or your fate's not going to be decided in that court, you're kept on this side of the police tape. And you have to ask yourself, if you're going to be treated like criminals in a place where you're supposed to be receiving justice or fairness, at some point, what does that become a self-fulfilling prophecy? At what point do you begin to encourage violence, or encourage incivility, or encourage deadly acts, or encourage standoffs, or encourage situations like this? But this is what we've become, where with armed non-Indian policemen and police tape, relatives who would like to just step foot in that trailer to hear things that I'm saying about why they belong, they're kept away. And if you think about all this history, and you think about our identity being under siege as the result of capitalism, and classism, and yes, racism, and fascism, chauvinism, and other things that are not our ways. And then you read this quote that was profound to me. It was stated during a TED speech by a National Geographic journalist who went to Pine Ridge. And he wasn't talking about disenrollment, but he talked about the plight of the Sioux Indians on what we all know is the most impoverished place in the entire country. And when you think about all those laws passed by the Congress for 2 centuries, in the name of manifest destiny, in the name of Indian land dispossession, in the name of forced assimilation and termination, this struck me as profound. The last chapter in any successful genocide is the one in which the oppressor, the United States government, the United States Congress, the United States Department of the Interior, the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs, can remove their hands and say, my God, what are these people doing to themselves? They're killing each other. They're killing themselves while we watch them die. This is how we came to own these United States. This is the legacy of Manifest Destiny. And the question is, so what do we do about it? The policy part of this conversation is one that I'm still scratching my head about. What do we do to reverse 2 centuries of genocidal federal policy that has us, I believe, at our knees right now? I mean, several generations of the last 7 generations have been afflicted by the byproducts of those policies. Have put us at a point where we are literally and figuratively killing ourselves for sake of greed and power and vendetta and things that are not a part of our traditional existence. So I don't have the answer to this yes, but I thought this Wilma Mankiller quote that I put on my Facebook page recently was profound. It's simple. You're not an Indian because you have a CBID card. You're not an Indian because of your mixed blood status. You're not an Indian because you don't have that card. You're not an Indian because you don't have that blood. An Indian's an Indian regardless of those things. An Indian's an Indian based on notions of kinship and belonging. So I don't yet know the solution, and I'll be honest, I'm skeptical of the solution. But I can tell you the one thing I've seen, having represented 500 tribal members or former tribal members in disenrollment, is there's a common denominator. And that is on those reservations or on those rancherias or in those communities, they've lost their way traditionally. When I ask where are the elders, I'm not pointed to anybody. When I say where are your songs or your teachings, those words aren't spoken or those words aren't sung. When I say what makes your government a strong government, what insulates it from corruption and nepotism and evil, there's no one identified, there's no institution to point to. These tribes have in many respects lost their way because of all the things I'm talking about. The centuries of genocidal policy and impact. My gut says you have to go back to those ways and restore those things for there to be any solution, or for there to be an indigenous policy that resolves the problem that we find ourselves in. And it was kinship before colonial influence. But you can also look now to places like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that talks about it as belonging. And the Nooksack 306 came up with this idea of we belong. And other tribal families being disenrolled have grabbed this idea of belonging. It wasn't a lawyer that came up with it, and I don't know if it had anything to do with this language, but it fits perfectly with what this United Nations proclamation says. We have the right to belong to an indigenous community or nation in accordance with the traditions and customs of the community or nation concerned. Not in accordance with Indian reorganization, with membership notions, with blood quantum criterion. No discrimination of any kind may arise from the exercise of such right. And unfortunately, we discriminate against ourselves on all bases. Again, on basis of class, on basis of race, on basis of intermarriage, on basis of sex. That's the very ugly and inconvenient truth that we're living with today. But those were not our ways, if you recall the first passage of my presentation, before those laws were passed, and the effects of those laws have taken hold over the last 2 centuries. Now to the art component. On Tuesday, a growing group of people are going to launch a video or visual advocacy campaign that's called Stop Disenrollment. And the image is again stop. With whatever word or whatever depiction or whatever phrase the person sees fit to express on their hand outstretched. And again, if you're moved by anything I've said and you want to put a word on your own hand, we'll take your picture and include you. But artists,